Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Make him the cutest that I've ever seen. Give him two lips like roses and clover. Then tell him that his lonesome nights are over. Sandman, I'm so alone. Don't have nobody to call my own. Please turn on your magic beam. Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream.
When Theosophy Fails. Flying Saucers and the Defining of Cognitive Dissonance. An essay on parapsychology and the history of psychology. Published in 1956, When Prophecy Fails, a social and psychological study of a modern group that predicted the destruction of the world, is one of the most famous psychology texts of all time. 2 years earlier, lead author Leon Festinger and a team of academic observers from Chicago had watched a small cult in Oak Park endure the disconfirmation of their prophecy that the world would end on the 21st of December, 1954. This message had come to Earth from Sananda, the risen Jesus in heaven. Yet the world had failed to end on schedule, and the expected flying saucer had not arrived to evacuate the believers as promised. Although some members of the group, which Festinger called the Seekers, departed from the group after this disappointment, proselyting activity increased afterwards for those still in the group. Until then, the Seekers had mostly tried to keep a low profile and minimize the sensational press attention to their activities. According to Festinger, it was the social support of the Seekers that made the difference when the prophecy failed. Most of them were able to rationalize the cognitive dissonance between expectation and result and revise their story because they were still together. Quote, for rationalization to be fully effective, support from others is needed to make the explanation or the revision seem correct, Festinger writes. Fortunately, the disappointed believer can usually turn to the others in the same movement, who have the same dissonance and the same pressures to reduce it. Support for the new explanation is hence forthcoming, and the members of the movement can recover somewhat from the shock of the disconfirmation. There is strength in numbers, and individuals take strength from beliefs they share with a group. Festinger, Henry Rieken, and Stanley Schachter anonymized the Seekers out of ethical consideration, since they were not public figures at the time. Thus, Marion Keech, the channeler at the center of the cult, is never identified in the book as Dorothy Martin, who went on to become Sister Thedra, leader of the Association of Sananda and Sanat Kumara. For it seems that Festinger and associates had only met Martin at the beginning of what was to be a long career as a spiritual figure. By 1954, Martin had already been a practitioner of alternate religion for most of her adult life. She would redouble her devotion every decade thereafter. The authors of When Prophecy Fails buried the lead in their eagerness to draw conclusions about group psychology. They did not appreciate that Dorothy Martin, early flying saucer cultist, was the perfect avatar of a religious movement rebranding itself for a new age by reimagining ancient cosmology with modern pseudoscience. At least 15 years earlier, while living in New York, Martin had been invited by an Indian acquaintance to attend a lecture on theosophy, Festinger reports. Martin read the works of Godfrey Ray King, that is, Guy Ballard, the founder of the I Am movement of Christian Theosophy. A spiritual biography of Dorothy Martin thus locates what are becoming familiar themes from our study of ufology in this series of essays. Here we once again see the bricolage of Christian theosophy, spiritualism, and ancient magic that would be rebranded as New Age beliefs in the 1970s, though they are much older. For example, the automatic writing Martin used to channel the risen Jesus is ancient. In its English language form, it goes back to Enochian magic, a 16th century invention that was still in use by Crowleyan magicians at the time, including L. Ron Hubbard. Transmitted through American spiritualism, then through American Christian theosophy, this activity became, quote, contact with ascended masters, an appropriation of Eastern religious wisdom into theosophy. Scientology had also influenced her thinking, though it was still early in the L. Ron Hubbard revelation. Before the prophecy failed, Martin, quote, joined a Dianetics group and was cleared by an auditor and friend who later took up residence in Martin's home, according to Festinger. A few weeks after the disconfirmation of the 21st of December, 1954, Martin was apprehensive about the police. So she, quote, decided to leave the Chicago area entirely and to join a Dianetics center in Arizona. She would return to that state again in her spiritual journey, finally settling near Sedona at the end. The term Scientology was a new word in 1954. Hubbard had started out with Dianetics and was still developing his technology. Martin was enthusiastic about the rebranding. I prefer to call it Scientology, which is the art and science of taking someone back as far in his life as he can go, she told Festinger's team. One of the chief advances in Scientology, she felt, was that it not only made possible an understanding of the circumstances of an individual's conception and birth, but also gave access to knowledge of one's identity in earlier incarnations, Festinger noted. Martin found Scientology when one of her earliest collaborators introduced her to, quote, a small informal circle of housewives who met in various high-veil homes to discuss Dianetics, Scientology, metaphysics, and occult topics, according to When Prophecy Fails. At one or more such meetings, Dorothy Martin read extracts from her lessons and described how she received these messages. Festinger writes that Bertha Blatsky, a pseudonym, another member of the Scientology group, had attended those lessons the previous spring. Scientology inarguably played the most important role in bringing the Seekers together. Another member of the Seekers, Edna Post, also a pseudonym, as well as her grown son, quote, had a history of participation in quasi-mystical groups with an intellectual orientation. Also, like Martin, Edna had been cleared by a Dianetics auditor and had gone on to a more advanced group that discussed Scientology. It was at a meeting of this group that Edna met Martin. Mrs. Blatsky and the Posts were evidently well acquainted through their earlier membership in the Scientology group, and Edna Post had at least met May Novick, another member of the Seekers. Furthermore, the authors of When Prophecy Fails, quote, conclude that Martin was an intermittent contact with a second group of students of Dianetics in downtown Chicago throughout the period that they observed the Seekers. L. Ron Hubbard did not create the Seekers. Rather, as we shall observe in future essays, Scientology has been a frequent waypoint for spiritual seekers, including the founders of many prominent UFO cults like the Seekers. Hubbard's science fiction pop psychology religion is a spiritual gravatar. It has shaped new clusters of conviction out of loose metaphysical material, then flung the resulting clumps of humanity into outer space beyond the reach of Earth gravity. Indeed, the Seekers attracted people interested in Scientology to their fold unbidden. An unnamed publisher, who attended a cult meeting unannounced and uninvited, quote, had read much modern physics and modern philosophy, and had been thus persuaded to adopt a Neoplatonic position, disbelieving in material reality. The world did not truly exist. The real world was a spiritual one, as above, so below, per the alchemists. The publisher added that, quote, his experiences in Dianetics and Scientology had added to this conviction. Neoplatonist cosmology is the wellspring of theosophical cosmology. Festinger et al. Call the Seekers spiritual eclectics to, quote, make it perfectly clear to the reader that the ideology was not invented nor created de novo purely in Dorothy Martin's head. For scarcely a single one of her ideas can be said to be unique, novel, or lacking in popular support. Only one prominent pair of people in the orbit of the Seekers was not connected to Scientology or Dianetics, insofar as can be discerned from the Festinger text. Dr. Charles Loghead and his wife Lily were dedicated liberal Protestants, hence we may count them as Christian Theosophists. Ostensibly a man with a scientific mind, Charles was in Dorothy Martin's living room because of the flying saucers. Aliens in spaceships were all the rage by 1954, and a consistent set of beliefs and practices was emerging to embrace the extraterrestrials as new versions of old gods. Hubbard's unique blend of space opera theology, pop psychology, pseudoscience, philosophy, and guru magic is just one prominent example of the common cultural material of the era being remixed as a, quote, spiritual technology. The youngest people in the Seekers were college students. Dr. Loghead, quote, attempted to proselyte for belief in Martin's messages and her prediction among some 15 or 20 young men and women who attended the Seekers' meetings fairly regularly, Festinger et al. Report. At first, Loghead held these meetings in his own church, in the form of a community club. But during the spring of 1954, quote, they requested that he eliminate discussion of flying saucers from the meetings of the Seekers, or else to stop holding meetings in the church altogether. It was to be the first of many embarrassments Loghead would suffer by the end of the year, including the loss of his job. Undeterred, Loghead moved his nascent flying saucer church into the living room of its prophet. When Loghead was invited to explain his views in a public meeting, quote, a letter was passed around for everyone to sign. It was addressed to President Eisenhower, asking him to make public the secret information the Air Force had accumulated on flying saucers. This was evangelism. Festinger's team had student observers come up with stories about mystical experiences and dreams in order to approach the cult. However, it was the prophecy of evacuation from Martin's backyard in a flying saucer that seemed to captivate the young people in the group most of all. The Seekers were therefore an amalgam of hip flying saucer enthusiasm and classic divinatory spirituality with an eschatology, that is, a story of how the world ends. Americans had the end of the world on their minds. The Korean War had only just settled into its uneasy ceasefire. French Indochina was a rising concern, The hydrogen bomb exploded in 1952, raising the stakes of the new Cold War. A sense of unease that the chance for lasting peace had been missed, that humanity might be doomed, was seeping into popular expression. The trend was pessimism. When newspapers began to report on the Seekers in the weeks before the ordained doomsday, it was the talk of flying saucers which captured the world's attention. Readers craved anything that might promise a future without war, or at least without nuclear Armageddon, or that at least resolved the dissonances in the world, even by destruction. A book by George Adamski and British aristocrat Desmond Leslie, Flying Saucers Have Landed, had been published to great fanfare in 1953, offering globalized spiritual pablum through the mouths of aliens from planets across the solar system. It was a promise of peace. Adamski, a longtime Christian Theosophist prophet, was the first UFO contactee in history, that is, the first person to claim physical contact with extraterrestrials on Earth. He claimed to have met a man from Venus at the end of 1952 and continued making new claims of alien encounters until his death in 1965. One of the people who backed up his story, George Hunt Williamson, took plaster casts of the bizarre footprints left behind by the alleged alien. Williamson signed an affidavit and agreed to form the George Adamski Foundation with two other acolytes of the Mount Palomar prophet. Quote, George Hunt Williamson and Al Bailey asked Adamski's permission to give an account of the whole business to an Arizona paper, and they all agreed, Colin Bennett writes. The Phoenix Gazette and the Oceanside Blade Tribune ran stories of the encounter in November. Photographs were included of the print casts and of the group, but unfortunately, Adamski's photographs did not turn out well. We can reasonably assume that these accounts by newspapers were the original sources that encouraged a friend of the British writer Desmond Leslie to suggest that he get in touch with Adamski. None of Adamski's witnesses actually saw or met the alien, however. Perhaps this tension explains why, just weeks after meeting Orthon, Adamski and his so-called witnesses split in bitter acrimony. It was a bizarre scene. Adamski called the FBI to the Palomar Gardens co-op and accused Williamson of being a fake psychic. In fact, Williamson was a patient under his psychic care for depression. Williamson had temporarily deserted his pregnant wife for this treatment, which involved channeling. Quote, for much of December 1952, Williamson lay prostrate with Indian spirits speaking through his vocal cords, Bennett writes. At the beginning of 1953, Williamson went his own way with fellow witness Al Bailey. Rather than become disillusioned with flying saucers altogether, the two men became spiritual competitors to Adamski. During 1954, they published The Saucers Speak, a book that cleverly traded Adamski's psychic contact with extraterrestrials for radio contact with extraterrestrials. Technology took over from theosophy, as the electromagnetic spectrum allowed, quote, communication with several planets in our own solar system and with spacecraft in our atmosphere from other solar systems. This communication took place, quote, in international Morse code through radiotelegraphy, although there was one instance where radiotelephony was employed by the spacecraft intelligences, according to the book. In the text, the authors claim to have made these contacts themselves by radio. They meet an unnamed old-timer ham radio operator who has also talked with aliens this way. They prevail upon a nameless expert to confirm that aliens are indeed talking to Earth. Sensational news stories from the 1920s about strange signals believed to emanate from Mars, perhaps the result of cosmic phenomena such as sunspots being received on primitive radio sets. These are revived for dramatic effect. The authors write darkly of outright threats that have prevented others from reporting their experiences, suppressing the truth that anyone can supposedly find with a radio set. Here was the fatal flaw, for ultimately people who listened for signals from space were disappointed. The Saucers Speak has not aged well, like Adamski's scenes set on board the flying saucers, because Williamson and Bailey engage in the same sort of pedantic dime store theosophical ramblings as Adamski. Quote, "We are all of the same creation. Warning, there will soon be a destructive blast to be felt on Earth," a message from Mars reads. "This is of your own manufacture." It is dated 2 August 1952, 2 months before the Ivy Mike test of the world's first H-bomb. Quote, "You are a dead civilization," the Martians warn. In the next sentence, "We want your cooperation. Time is limited." The worlds of outer space are organized for peace, so Earth must get with the program, which is explicitly spiritual. Otherwise, Earth might get hurt. Some destruction will come for sure. Without the spiritual mumbo-jumbo, it would come across as a galactic mafia selling insurance to a storekeeper. As if witnessing door-to-door rather than by radio, the Martians complain that the Earth people, quote, "deny the Creator himself." They have better spiritual technology, these Martians say. "Why are your peoples unbelievers?" they ask, citing atomic energy, capitalized for emphasis, and all types of natural disasters as signs of imminent world collapse from insufficient spiritual progress. A message from February 1953 resonates with the moralizing environmental catastrophism of the climate era. Quote, "We have but to look around us, and we immediately know what we have done." Humans must answer, quote, "the desperate need of a sickened world," if they are to avoid destruction. It is a one-sided communication. The Martians are utterly incurious about Earth. They have already learned our language and shared it with the other space brothers. We are mere students being lectured by such exalted beings as Agfa Afa of Uranus and Kedar Leku, a Saturnian who was, quote, "the head of the Interplanetary Council Circle on Mastercraft and elected from the universe." These didactic, eye-watering sections are interspersed with imaginary radio chatter between galactic call signs. Jupiter 9999, Ankar 22 speaking, Bell flight from Jupiter joining Mars, Jupiter now leading group, Mercury, Morningstar, Venus, Andromeda 26470, and Wolf 358 are also in group. Developed with sessions from a Ouija board rather than a radio, the text lurches back and forth between empty profundities and these quaint imitations of military radio chatter. Rather like ham radio operators, the authors collect an impressive list of contacts with space brothers from around the universe. Na-9 from Neptune, Wan-4 of the Saphanian planets, Eris, the space brother, Sutku of Saturn, and so on. Not by coincidence, these are all names straight out of the Neoplatonist cosmology of ascended masters that informed Theosophy, just as Adamski was doing with his cosmic brothers. Extraterrestrial contact was emerging from a theosophical imaginarium. The scientific historical pretensions of the Saucers Speak are also borrowed from the Blavatskyan blending of now discarded 19th century theories about human origins and prehistory with an eclectic global mythology. Quote, "Ancient records show beyond the shadow of a doubt that the saucers have been here for centuries," William and Bailey write. Like Adamski, they were projecting the new flying saucer interpretation of Theosophy into humanity's past, creating the ancient aliens of latter-day History Channel infamy, all in imitation of Theosophy's founding figures. Dubious as this text may appear to our jaded modern eyes, it was the milieu in which the seekers came together during 1954. Psychic contact with aliens was all the rage. A self-serious literary discussion of the flying saucers had galvanized public attention. Films and television shows were becoming as important as newsstands and bookshelves for shaping public opinion. Already, a substantial minority of American households had a TV set. At the same time, Bennett notes, quote, "Interest in occult philosophy, fringe religion, and metaphysics in general was perhaps at its lowest ebb in European history. Americans, too, had likewise lost interest in theosophy and esotericism in the age of the atom and fins on automobiles." Exhortations to spiritual unity and peace thus needed something new to animate modern audiences. The flying saucer would do just fine. Williamson and Bailey published The Saucers Speak through an imprint called New Age Publishing. The rebranding of Theosophy and occultism as New Age was therefore underway when Dorothy Martin began sharing her messages from the risen Jesus Sananda with the rest of the seekers in Oak Park. After it all went sideways, she did not stay with Scientology. Instead, Martin wound up in Peru with George Hunt Williamson during 1956. He had established the Monastery of the Brotherhood of the Seven Rays, and he was searching for the golden sun disk of Mu. During 1961, both of them returned to Arizona. Williamson wrote a book about his mystical searches, Secret of the Andes, under the pseudonym Brother Philip from Chicago. He would later adopt the name Michael Dobrinovich to recall his Serbian family, publishing books on esoteric spirituality under 3 different names before his death. Martin founded the Association of Sananda and Sanat Kumara in 1956. Quote, "The advanced beings she channeled were seen as both spiritually advanced and coming from outer space," J. Gordon Melton notes in the Gale Encyclopedia of Occultism and Parapsychology. Problematically, however, the space spirits could move George Hunt Williamson and Al Bailey just as easily as they had moved George Adamski. Martin's experience in 1954 had also involved a split within the group, a feminine power struggle over spiritual authority that the world would have entirely missed without Festinger's team of observers, who gave it short shrift. Dorothy Martin died in 1992 without leaving a successor to take over her channeling duties. She had learned to be leery of would-be assistant mediums early on. Quote, "At about the same time that she began to receive messages from non-terrestrial sources, Martin had become actively interested in one of the major popular mysteries of our time, flying saucers." According to Festinger et al., Martin's, quote, "interest led her to attend 1 or more lectures on the subject by an expert on saucers who expounded the belief that these objects did indeed transport visitors from outer space or other planets. The connection between extraterrestrial messages and such visitors was probably immediately apparent to Martin," they write. It was an explicitly spiritual interest and connection. Her first spirit contact was her own dead father, however. These messages were garbled and confusing, earning a rebuke from Dorothy Martin's mother. Rather than give up, Martin, quote, concluded that the fault lay at least partially in her, and set herself the task of developing, through concentration, through prayers for help and guidance, and through constant obedient practice, a higher level of skill in transcribing the messages from the spiritual realm. Soon she felt the presence of, quote, other beings or intelligences that were attempting to express themselves through her pencil. After the embarrassment of connecting with her father had worn off, Martin developed a brief contact with a mercurial elder brother in the astral plane. More 19th century scripts associated with spiritualism and theosophy and transmitted by popular culture in the expanding age of mass media were being revised as explicitly spiritual communications. In 1953, Dr. Loghead traveled to meet George Adamski and obtain an enlarged drawing of the mysterious footprints of Orthon that George Hunt Williamson had cast. When he returned home, his wife Lily took an interest in the footprints and, quote, charged herself with the task of interpreting the message in them. Quote, her interpretation of the footprints forecast a rising of the submerged continents of Mu and Atlantis, an event that would be consistent with the flooding of the North American continent, according to Festinger et al. Furthermore, quote, in August, when Martin received the prediction of a flood on December 21st, Lily Loghead emphasized that this prediction was all the more likely to be correct, since her own interpretation, arrived at independently, was corroborative evidence. The relative secrecy of the seeker's cult thus created an echo chamber that reinforced belief with belief. Upon receipt of one confusing message from Sananda, for example, Lily and Dorothy concluded together that the divine guardians were referring to the Loghead's daughter. As this spiritual trust grew with her core followers, Martin became more confident and her pencil more productive. Her attestations also began to reflect the esoteric hobbies of the Logheads, such as Atlantis, Mu, and the deadly atomic war with alsatopes, that is, prehistoric nuclear weapons, which destroyed them both. A creation myth emerged in which Lucifer and the scientists blew up the planet Kar in rebellion against Christ and God and, quote, the people who follow the light, disturbing all the universes. The Seekers' cult was tracking the pessimistic trend of the times. They shared a, quote, deep concern with both the dimmest events of the distant past and the most awful possibilities of the immediate future, because the devil and his minions were once again at work on Earth. In July 1954, after building up this group delusion for nearly 3 months, Martin received a message from the astral plane that interested parties should go to a local military airfield on a certain day, quote, by noon in order to witness the landing of a Tola, or spaceship. With a small group of followers, Martin went to the airfield at the appointed time, taking a picnic lunch. They did not see any flying saucers. However, at one point, Martin, quote, became aware that an unknown man had approached the party. Although the road was long and straight and the fields bordering it offered neither cover nor concealment, she had not seen him walking toward them. It was as if he had materialized out of thin air. He crossed the highway toward the group, and as he drew nearer, she sensed something strange, almost eerie in his appearance and manner. She recalls a somewhat strange look in his eye and a curiously rigid bearing. Martin offered the man a sandwich and some juice. He declined. I couldn't imagine anybody that time of day on a lonely highway not wanting a cold drink. I asked him again, but he just said no thank you. A vernacular emerges in the oral history of this encounter, as Martin struggles to sound scientific and spiritual at one same time. Quote, I looked at his eyes that looked through my soul, and the words sent electric currents to my feet, yet I wasn't on the beam. As we stood there looking in the sky for saucers, he would look up and then he would look at us, at me especially. After I had offered him food, he turned and walked away. I felt very sad. I didn't know why at the time. I thought, what can I give him to eat? What else have we got that I can give him? I turned to my car to get a slice of watermelon, which was about 20 feet away. As I reached it, I looked back and he was gone, just gone. He was no place to be seen. And I can't tell you, there's just no word for it. I knew something was going on that I didn't understand. I knew I was close to something. Rather than a universal law to unite mankind, the universe had provided a confused stranger who was neither hungry nor thirsty. In her own confusion and desire to please the stranger, Dorothy Martin was left to fill the unknowns with whatever she wanted. In a preview of future events, the group ties were stronger after this disconfirmation than they had been before it. The day ended without any saucer sightings. Still, when she consulted the logheads and another close confidant later, everyone agreed that something had happened on the roadside, but we didn't know what it was or how to explain it. Surely, nothing meant something. Quote, we were all sensitized to that degree that something had happened, though we had no mental concept of it. On the 2nd of August, a message from Martin's pencil revealed that the mysterious man had been Sananda. The Seekers finally told the world about themselves on 30 August. Loghead, a former missionary to Egypt with his wife, was, quote, consistently more active in publicizing his beliefs and had a greater sense of the urgency of his mission than Martin. His Christian concern for others, his fear of the imminent global flood, was too imminent for him to be silent anymore. Signing his name to a pair of press releases, one of which mentioned Martin by name, Dr. Loghead got the incredulous attention of an eager press. Now a second uncanny encounter occurred. Quote, only one consequence of the newspaper publicity is worth more than casual mention, and that is the visit of the spacemen. One morning shortly after the appearance of the newspaper story in Oak Park, Martin answered a knock at her front door to find 2 men who asked to talk to her. The spokesman for the pair seemed quite conversant with Martin's extrasensory communications, with the forecast of the flood, and with her recent publicity. He appeared to be a perfectly ordinary human being, according to Martin's subsequent account of the interview, while his companion had a strange appearance and furthermore uttered not a word during the entire visit. When she inquired their identity, the spokesman replied, I am of this planet, but he is not. And Martin could not obtain any more information than that. Although the discussion lasted at least half an hour, the burden of the visitor's message was simple. She was not to publish or publicize her messages any further. Instead, she was to seal the books in her possession and wait for further orders, which presumably would come from outer space. No further authority or reason for this command was given than that the time is not right now. Having conveyed their message, the 2 men left. As we have established in this series of essays, encounters with so-called men in black are roughly as old as the first flying saucer reports. Uncanny movement and behavior, along with implied and explicit threats, abound in reports of MIB encounters. However, these bizarre meetings rarely ever persuade anyone to remain silent for very long. Instead, the added pressure from outside seems to compel belief. To date, no writing psychologist has tackled this topic. Despite this glaring report in a foundational text of the scientific field of psychology, the man in black encounter remains a fringe topic, restricted to the domain of parapsychology and paranoid tropes about big government, the deep state, and so on. It would be too easy to invoke sinister federal powers here, however. For it is also possible that, given all the buzz in and around Oak Park, some random group of people was just trolling Dorothy Martin. In December, with doomsday approaching, Martin began to receive, quote, a series of telephone calls from two young men who told her they were from the planet Clarion. Martin came home on a Friday evening to find a note on her television set. "We were here, but you were not," signed by the boys from Clarion. They kept calling her the next day, and Martin's conviction grew that her callers really were from outer space and really had visited her home the previous evening. Dangerously, quote, her excitement over this evidence was matched only by her willingness to accept the orders that her callers began to issue. On the third day of this psychological warfare, Martin emerged from her bedroom, where the telephone was located, quote, with tears in her eyes, sobbing joyously, "He is coming. He is coming." She was convinced that Sananda himself was visiting them that very evening. A 20-year-old man did arrive at her door that evening. He brought 4 young male companions. They requested to speak with Dr. Loghead in private. After a half-hour conversation with him, they also spoke to Dorothy Martin in private for an hour. They were spacemen, all right, or as he put it, some of the boys from upstairs, Festinger et al. Relate. They had really put him through a quiz. He had never dealt with such brilliant minds, he said. Loghead had penetrated their disguise as Earthlings as soon as they walked in the door, he explained. But their superhuman minds were something to behold. Their visit was in the nature of a test, the doctor said, a check on whether he and Marion could give them the right answers. At that very moment, he added, the spacemen were, quote, trying to get Marion to retract. They're trying to get her to take back all the things she's been saying. They say it's all mixed up and false. It's a check, all right. Opinions varied in the living room. Although 2 of the younger seekers were skeptical, sure instead that the 5 young men were, quote, a bunch of kids trying to put on a front, Edna Post became equally sure the visitors had come from outer space. However, Martin emerged from the bedroom, quote, weeping, her frail body turned to the wall and her fists clenched at her sides. After trying again with the boys in private for another half hour, she finally allowed them to leave and then told her flock of believers that the visit had indeed been a test. They kept forcing me to take back things, Martin said. The leader of the boys kept trying to pressure me into saying they were not true. They kept telling me that what I had said was all false and mixed up. And they told me that they were in contact with outer space too, and all the writings I had were wrong, and that everything I was predicting was wrong. But she had passed the test, she said, as the spaceman had reassured her before departing. Now she solicited the reassurances of the group. Quote, a chorus of assent followed. At least one person voiced doubts, but they failed to register with the room. 3 of the supposed spacemen had, quote, looked exactly alike, and they had refused earthly nourishment while inside the house, the Logheads and Edna Post began to argue. Quote, the flood of confirming and supporting detail continued, Festinger et al. Report. The interpretation of the visit was rapidly becoming a settled question, and the group was waxing enthusiastic about it. The representatives from outer space had come and subjected them to the supreme test, and they had passed. No matter how hard the outside world pressed against them, it merely seemed to make the seekers more fervent in their beliefs. The only real threat to the integrity of the cult was coming from within. Quote, Bertha Blatsky, a tall, robust, powerful-looking woman in her early 40s, had been a Scientology auditor for at least one other member of the Seekers. She was childless and blamed the empty promises of Catholicism for her disappointment at being barren. Blatsky was in the Martin home 4 weeks before Doomsday, with Festinger himself present to witness, when she unexpectedly began to channel a message directly from Sananda. Martin was having trouble making contact with the spirit world that evening. Blatsky's performance was brief, merely reciting the first commandment with dramatic flair. Nevertheless, it was an instant hit with the living room. Martin, quote, added her envious congratulations when she mentioned that she had wanted, even prayed for the power of speech, but had been given writing instead. Festinger et al. Relate. At the next meeting, quote, the group saw a new and forceful Bertha. Gone were the incoherence, the repetition, the appeals to Martin for help. Her assumption of authority was corroborated when it became clear that the voice speaking through her this night was not that of Sananda, but the Creator himself. Having thus trumped Martin's ace, Bertha proceeded to discuss such matters as the good, the will, the I, and the am. As she progressed in these instructions, she became more forceful and more domineering. This performance ended with a confirmation of Doomsday from God himself. For, quote, tonight you are in the presence of the Creator, who has chosen the greatest prophet, the Bertha, who ever was or ever will be, Bertha Blatsky announced. A split in leadership loomed, as the Creator and Sananda made themselves known through separate women. Quote, having tasted and relished the satisfactions of leadership, Blatsky was clearly prepared to accept the mantle which, in the beginning, she had worn so uneasily. On 3 and 4 December, just 17 days before Judgment Day, Blatsky spent 2 days asserting her authority and trying to, quote, dominate the group. She mocked the vegetarians of the group by bringing roast beef to lunch. She made petty power plays over who should sit where and who was welcome in the living room. She rubbished the language of Martin's messages. I don't have to use fancy words like thee and thou and shalt. We are talking cold turkey. You have had all the fancy words you need used on you before. There has been too much time wasted on this sort of stuff. She went upstairs moaning about giving birth to the Christ child, and returned to inform them that the scene had been a holy joke from heaven. By the end of the weekend, however, Bertha's behavior had created a perplexing situation, for she had challenged some of Martin's most dearly held tenets, but she had not produced the orders that everyone was waiting for in regards to Doomsday preparations. Worse, her husband was opposed to her participation in the Seekers. So once Mr. Blatsky found out about his wife's new career in channeling, he gave Bertha a 1 January deadline to give up the cult, or he would have her committed. Psychologically deflated, Bertha Blatsky's confidence in her ability to talk with the Creator's voice had been seriously undermined. Her prophethood had lasted just 10 days. In the wake of the failed Doomsday prophecy, she could no longer risk her husband's wrath and stopped attending meetings altogether. To sell spirituality as a long-term career, a guru must maintain sole proprietorship of their cult. Divided ownership will eventually lead to splits over doctrine and schism in the group. L. Ron Hubbard had already learned this lesson from the failures of Dianetics, and he was busy reinventing his religion when the events recounted here took place. Secrecy and unified authority were keys to his success. In 1966, more than a decade later, Hubbard began promulgating his OT3 level teachings. These included the story of Lord Xenu, a space opera scripture from which Hubbard constructs his universe of reincarnated Thetans. Initiates are only introduced to this bizarre new myth after spending years of time, and usually tens of thousands of dollars, in Hubbard's spiritual technology. Nor did Hubbard much care about who or what came after his death. Taking only minimal measures to appoint a successor, and leaving behind nothing new for them to reveal, Hubbard set the stage for an upstart bag boy, David Miscavige, to seize control of Scientology. Dorothy Martin waited more than a decade after the disappointment of December 1954 before founding another cult, and this time she made sure it was really hers, with no possible usurpations of her spiritual authority. Martin founded the Association of Sananda and Sanat Kumara in the same year that George Adamski died. He, too, had fallen out with an acolyte who claimed the same spiritual authority as himself. Like Bertha Blatsky, George Hunt Williamson also sought what he thought to be better, more modern language for the outmoded verbal antiques of Adamski. Dissonance creates dissidence. In turn, Martin had appropriated the radio beam into her own language 1 year after Williamson's Flying Saucers Speak popularized the idea of alien radio transmissions. The logheads were greatly influenced by Adamski's alien contact story and considered the mysterious footprints of Orthon to be confirmation of Martin's prophecies, which in fact reflected their own fascinations with hangover topics from 19th century theosophical pseudoscience. This team of believers was able to convince each other that nothing meant something, and that even when prophecies failed, they were fulfilled in some spiritual way that remained unseen. Leon Festinger and his collaborators observed as much of these events as one might hope for. Although they were focused on the cognitive dissonance resulting from a failed prophecy, and how believers overcame that dissonance, they had also discovered a dissonance within the group, a clash of personalities, and a spiritual competition that seems to be common in guru-based cults. Finally, Festinger's team had accidentally recorded one of the most detailed accounts in the history of ufology of the so-called Men in Black appearing out of nowhere. Just like the vast majority of such accounts, the encounters that the seekers had with Men in Black did not lead them to abandon belief in flying saucers. On the contrary, the impression of official opposition and a consequent sense of oppression caused the core group of believers to reinforce one another in their shared beliefs. One cannot reason with the true believer or argue with the sacred. What we can do is observe how their stories change over time and what remains the same. History emerges from that liminal space and the dissonances within it. Political science has a word for the phenomenon of groups splitting and atomizing under pressure. They are fissiparous, as in fissile, inferring the possibility of sudden heat, enlightenment, and radioactive fallout. Among the spiritual, such events can alter the universe of possibilities.
Said that I won't be